At 11:42 p.m., a reinforced corporate sedan traveling at 85 miles per hour shattered a concrete highway barrier. Inside was Elias Vaughn, the ruthless billionaire founder of a global logistics monopoly, a man who viewed human beings strictly as expendable variables on a balance sheet. While Elias lay in a secured trauma ward with a severe traumatic brain injury and total amnesia, his sister and the board of directors did not visit. Instead, they executed a mathematically precise legal protocol to seize his $3 billion empire. They intentionally isolated him, manipulating state conservatorship laws to declare him socially abandoned and permanently incapacitated. But the board made one fatal miscalculation. They didn't anticipate that the only person to breach the hospital perimeter would be Silas Merrick, a 62-year-old landscaper. Elias had mercilessly fired Silas without severance just 72 hours before the crash over a microscopic defect in the estate's lawn. The billionaire was about to learn that a true empire isn't built in a boardroom. It is rebuilt step by step by the exact people you threw away. Before we see what he does next, tell me in the comments where you're watching from today. Please leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and let's dive back into the story. The physical reality of a high-speed automotive collision does not respect net worth. When the steel of Elias Vaughn's sedan buckled against concrete, the kinetic energy transferred directly into his skull. The impact generated massive deceleration forces, shattering localized neural pathways and triggering catastrophic trauma. Paramedics extracted him from the crushed vehicle at 11:54 p.m. His blood pressure was plummeting, his vitals crashing. He was transported to the secure intensive care wing of Memorial General, a facility designed for extreme privacy and acute trauma intervention. Dr. Emmett Adler, the chief of neurosurgery, operated strictly on statistical probability and anatomical facts. Standing beneath the harsh, fluorescent lights of Surgical Bay 4, he evaluated the digital readouts of Elias's cranial scans. The diagnosis was a severe traumatic brain injury, accompanied by an expanding subdural hematoma. The swelling in Elias's brain was applying lethal pressure to his brainstem. Adler executed a rapid emergency craniotomy to relieve the internal pressure. The surgical intervention was a mechanical procedure, drilling through bone, draining the localized hemorrhage, and stabilizing the pressure metrics. For 48 hours, Elias existed on life support, sustained entirely by a ventilator and intravenous chemical drips. His survival came down to a margin of error so small it was almost invisible. According to Dr. Adler's post-operative report, the intracranial swelling subsided by exactly 2%. That specific 2% reduction was the absolute biological threshold between Elias experiencing irreversible brain death and maintaining basic autonomic functions. He survived not because of his wealth, but because of a 2% biological margin. 5 days after the collision, the heavy rhythmic hiss of the mechanical ventilator ceased. Elias Vaughn opened his eyes. There was no dramatic gasp for air. There was only the sterile, agonizing glare of the overhead LED lights burning into his retinas. The air smelled of industrial bleach and sharp iodine. He felt the cold, stiff fabric of the hospital sheets against his skin, the dull ache radiating through his skull, and the restrictive pull of intravenous lines taped securely to the back of his right hand. He tried to form a thought, a baseline understanding of his spatial orientation, but his mind encountered an absolute terrifying void. He reached for a name, a location, a memory of the previous hour, but the cognitive files were completely eradicated. The architecture of his identity had been wiped clean. He did not know his age. He did not know his profession. He did not know the face he wore. The billionaire who had controlled a global supply chain spanning 3 continents was now reduced to a fundamental state of biological terror. He was a blank slate trapped in an unfamiliar body. The heavy soundproof door to his private suite clicked open. Cora Hensley, the primary attending nurse for the secure ward, stepped into the room. She was 38, dressed in standard blue scrubs, her demeanor entirely professional and detached. She checked the digital monitors measuring his cardiac rhythm before making eye contact. Elias's throat was raw from the intubation tube. He attempted to speak, his voice cracking into a dry, abrasive whisper. "Who?" He swallowed hard, fighting the physiological panic rising in his chest. "Who am I?" Cora paused, her hand resting on the edge of the metal bed rail. She looked at him with a clinically neutral expression, trained specifically to handle severe amnesia protocols. She did not offer false comfort or emotional reassurance. "You are in a secure medical facility," Cora stated flatly, adjusting the flow rate of his saline drip. "You sustained a severe head injury in a motor vehicle accident. Your physiological vitals are stable." "My name," Elias rasped, his fingers gripping the sterile white sheets. "I don't know my name." "Your name is Elias Vaughn," Cora replied, documenting his cognitive response time on her digital tablet. The name meant absolutely nothing to him. It was a collection of syllables completely disconnected from any emotional anchor. Elias stared at the blank white ceiling. He waited for a face to emerge from the darkness of his mind. A mother, a sibling, a spouse, a friend. Someone who would be rushing through that heavy metal door, frantic with worry, demanding to see him. "Where is my family?" Elias asked, his voice shaking with a sudden, desperate vulnerability. "Is someone coming?" Cora finished her documentation. She looked at the empty visitor log on her tablet, a screen that had remained completely blank for 5 consecutive days. In the outside world, Vaughn Logistics was aggressively managing a massive corporate crisis, ensuring the supply chain continued to operate without disruption. But inside this sterile, hermetically sealed room, the silence was absolute. "No, Mr. Vaughn," Cora said quietly, her voice devoid of pity, stating only the procedural truth of the ward. "There is no one waiting outside. You are entirely alone." While Elias Vaughn lay locked inside the absolute silence of the isolation ward, the corporate machine he had built continued to process data with chilling efficiency. 3 floors below, in a private executive conference room overlooking the city harbor, the air was warm and smelled of expensive dark roast coffee and polished mahogany. There were no tears here, no panicked phone calls to specialists, and no frantic vigil by a hospital bed. Vivian Vaughn sat at the head of the long glass table, her face entirely pale, her expression an absolute mask of corporate neutrality. She was 42, dressed in a sharp, tailored slate gray blazer, her fingers resting lightly on the bezel of a tablet displaying live market indices. Sitting directly across from her was Alden Strickland, the chief operating officer, whose cold blue eyes remained fixed on a series of neurological metrics forwarded directly from Dr. Adler's office. "The medical report from Memorial General is definitive, Vivian," Alden stated, his voice a flat, measured baritone that held no emotional weight. "Elias has suffered a catastrophic neurological event. The trauma has induced total retrograde amnesia, accompanied by a severe cognitive deficit. He does not recognize his name, his position, or the company. As of 6 a.m., his capacity to execute corporate governance is mathematically 0. Vivian did not look out the window at the freezing winter rain lashing against the glass. She slowly scrolled through the corporate bylaws of Vaughn Logistics, stopping at a specific deeply buried clause that her brother had authored himself a decade ago to protect the company from unexpected executive vulnerability. "Elias built this monopoly on a single, unshakable principle, Alden," Vivian replied, her voice dropping to a low, precise cadence. "He taught us that a global supply chain cannot tolerate a weak link. He spent 20 years ruthlessly cutting away any variable that slowed the momentum of the machine. Right now, the weakest link in this corporation is Elias himself. I am not betraying his legacy. I am simply applying his own rule to him. Alden tilted his head, his fingers tapping a light, rhythmic cadence against his leather-bound portfolio. The legal risk is substantial. The board of directors holds 40% of the voting shares, but Elias retains the controlling interest. If he regains baseline function before we stabilize the transition, any restructuring we execute will be legally nullified by the federal court. He won't regain it in time, Vivian stated coldly, sliding her tablet across the glass toward the COO. This is a draft for an emergency fiduciary conservatorship filing. We are not alleging mental incompetence due to disease. We are citing an acute medical incapacity that renders him socially abandoned and unable to manage his assets. By restricting the visitor perimeter under the guise of an executive, sterile neurological environment, we prevent any outside parties or secondary board members from establishing a baseline of recovery with him. Alden scanned the legal document, a thin, ruthless smirk touching the edge of his lips. And what about the legal notifications? The court requires a formal family assessment to verify the absence of support before granting an expedited conservatorship. I am his only living immediate relative, Alden, Vivian said, her eyes narrowing into two slits of cold determination. If I declare to the magistrate that his recovery requires absolute sensory isolation, and the company's legal counsel backs the motion with an emergency stability affidavit, the court will grant the temporary control within 72 hours. We lock down his personal accounts, freeze his voting rights, and absorb his shares into the corporate treasury before the state bar even processes the initial accident report. By 9 o'clock tomorrow morning, Elias Vaughn will be legally invisible inside his own empire. Alden closed his portfolio with a crisp, definitive snap that echoed sharply against the wood panels. Then, I will notify the corporate legal team to file the motion with the clerk before the courts close at 5. The machine continues to move, Vivienne. Make sure it moves faster than his memory, Vivienne whispered, turning her gaze back to the cold, wet gray horizon. Inside the secure isolation wing of Memorial General, the digital wall clock clicked silently to 2:14 a.m. The automated climate control hummed a low, mechanical monotone that drove the silence deep into Elias Vaughn's skull. He lay perfectly still, staring at the green LED light of the intravenous infusion pump. Without an active memory, his mind had no anchor to hold on to, leaving him floating in a state of constant, disorienting static. Suddenly, the door clicked open. Cora Hensley stepped into the room, her movements swift and silent. She didn't look at Elias, but her eyes were fixed on a newly printed corporate directive on her digital screen. Mr. Vaughn, Cora said, her voice dropping to a flat professional whisper. The hospital administration has received an emergency legal mandate from your corporate board. Effective immediately, your patient profile has been placed under an executive protective lockout. All external telecommunications are severed, and the visitor log is permanently closed under a sterile neurological environment protocol. Elias turned his head slowly, the movement sending a dull ache through his skull. Closed? What does that mean? Is my sister coming? No, Cora replied flatly. It means no one is permitted to request your medical status, and no one is allowed past the security double doors of this wing. The directive is signed by your power of attorney, Vivian Vaughn. She has cited immediate cognitive preservation as the legal basis for your absolute isolation. To the outside world, you do not exist on the general patient registry anymore, Mr. Vaughn. Cora finished her rounds and walked toward the exit. As the heavy soundproof door sealed shut behind her, the silence returned, heavier and sharper than before. Elias closed his eyes, attempting to force his mind past the blank wall of his amnesia. The absolute isolation was working exactly as Vivian and Alden Strickland had intended. It was starving his brain of any external stimulus that could trigger a baseline neural recovery. He was a prisoner of his own blank mind, buried alive inside a $3 billion corporate vacuum. A sudden, sharp, metallic click from the secondary maintenance corridor broke the silence. The door didn't swing wide, but the electronic lock disengaged with a distinct snap. Through the dim, shadowed threshold of the utility entrance, a figure stepped into the light. It wasn't a corporate lawyer, an executive assistant, or a doctor. It was an older man, 62 years old, with broad, weathered shoulders that carried the permanent slouch of decades of physical labor. He was dressed in a heavy, faded canvas work jacket that smelled faintly of damp earth and cold winter air. His large, calloused hands were deeply lined, the joints of his fingers swollen from severe arthritis. He stood in the clinical light, holding a heavy stainless steel thermos and a small canvas tool bag. Elias stared at the stranger. "Who are you?" The nurse said, "The floor is locked down." The older man didn't flinch. He stepped closer to the foot of the bed, his dark eyes fixed on Elias with a hard, unreadable intensity. "The front doors are locked, Mr. Vaughn," Silas Merrick said, his voice a deep, gravelly baritone. "But I spent 10 years managing the utility lines around this facility before you put me on your estate. I know exactly which service elevator bypasses the security desk." Elias gripped the guardrails. "Did my company send you? Did Vivienne send you?" Silas let out a short, cold breath. He set the heavy steel thermos down on the bedside table with a dull, metallic thud. "Your sister doesn't know I'm here, and if she did, she'd have the sheriff throw me in a cell," Silas replied, unbuttoning his canvas coat. "3 days ago, you stood on the south lawn of your estate and told me my 40 years of labor didn't mean a damn thing because a chemical mix turned 2% of your grass yellow. You fired me on the spot, canceled my medical coverage, and took my pension before I could pack my tools." Elias recoiled, staring at the old man's hands. I did that?" "Yes," Silas said, stepping closer until his shadow completely blocked the glare of the overhead lights. "You did exactly that. You threw me out like trash." Elias's voice trembled, his mind reeling from the sudden revelation of his own past cruelty. "Then why are you here? If I ruined you, why did you come?" Silas reached into his tool bag, pulled out a clean plastic bowl, and began to unscrew the lid of the thermos. The rich, heavy aroma of roasted garlic and thick chicken broth instantly flooded the sterile, chemical air of the room. "I didn't come here to forgive you, Mr. Vaughn," Silas stated flatly, his dark eyes locked onto Elias's pale face. "And I didn't come here to look for a payout. I came because I saw the news of the crash, and I know how your corporate machine operates. I knew your board would lock this room down. I knew they would leave you in the dark to rot. I came because a human being is not an asset to be balanced, and no one, not even a man as cold as you, should have to learn how to live again completely alone in a room without a name. Now, take the spoon and eat." The heavy plastic spoon trembled in Elias Vaughn's hand. He had spent the last 5 days sustained entirely by a mechanized feeding tube, his body processing synthetic nutrients. When the hot chicken broth hit his tongue, the sensory impact was violently overwhelming. It tasted like earth, salt, and raw human effort. It tasted like survival. Silas Merrick stood at the foot of the bed, his canvas coat unbuttoned, his massive arthritic hands resting on the metal rail. He did not offer words of encouragement. He simply watched the billionaire eat with the cold, pragmatic assessment of a man evaluating a damaged piece of equipment. "The synthetic drip they have you on keeps the heart beating, but it doesn't rebuild the muscle," Silas growled. "Your brain is trapped in the dark. It needs sensory anchors to pull itself back together, scent and heat. You need fuel." Elias swallowed, his raw throat burning. "Why are you doing this? If I ruined you, why?" "Because nobody should learn how to live again in a room without a name," Silas replied flatly. He took the empty plastic bowl, wiped it clean, and sealed the dented steel thermos. "I will be back tomorrow night at exactly 2 a.m. Do not tell the nurses. If your sister's board finds out I am breaching the perimeter, they will transfer you to a black site facility where I can't reach you. You are going to play dead for the cameras, Mr. Vaughn. But when I am here, you are going to work." Silas slipped out through the maintenance corridor just as the digital clock hit 2:45 a.m. 10 minutes later, the main door hissed open. Cora Hensley stepped in to check the intravenous lines. She stopped halfway to the bed. Her professional neutrality cracked for a fraction of a second. She smelled the roasted garlic. She looked at the digital cardiac monitor. Elias's resting heart rate had stabilized. His blood pressure was sitting in a perfectly healthy, sustainable baseline. Cora knew exactly what Vivian Vaughn was doing to her brother. Cora reached into her pocket, pulled out a sterile wipe, and silently cleaned a microscopic smudge of broth off the table. "Whoever is coming through that utility door needs to use the secondary service elevator," Cora said quietly, her eyes fixed on the IV monitor. "The cameras on that route have been malfunctioning since Tuesday. I haven't filed the repair ticket yet." For the next 7 nights, the routine remained unbroken. At exactly 2 a.m., the electronic lock would disengage. Silas would emerge from the shadows, carrying the steel thermos. He fed Elias real food, replacing the sterile hospital nutrition with dense, calorie-heavy meals. But on the 8th night, the dynamic shifted. Silas walked to the side of the bed and forcefully pulled the heavy clinical sheets back, exposing Elias's atrophied legs. "The food was just to stabilize the foundation," Silas said, pulling a folded, crumpled piece of paper and a short wooden pencil from his jacket pocket. "Tonight, we start rebuilding the structure. You are going to stand up." Elias stared at his legs. "I can't. The doctor said the neurological pathways are severely compromised." "I know how roots work, Mr. Vaughn," Silas said, leaning over the bed. "If you leave them in a sterile, comfortable box, they rot. Roots only grow when they have to push through hard dirt. You are going to put your feet on this cold floor, and you are going to push." Silas flattened the crumpled piece of paper on the bedside table. He used the pencil to draw a crude, rigid grid on the blank side of the sheet. "I am going to track your movement. Every inch goes on this paper." With Silas gripping him tightly under the arms, Elias forced his legs over the edge of the mattress. The pain was immediate and blinding. It felt like shattered glass tearing through his nervous system. He held the weight for exactly 4 seconds before his knees violently buckled. Silas caught him, hauling his dead weight back onto the mattress. "It's useless," Elias choked out, his gown soaked in cold sweat. "I failed." "You stood for 4 seconds, Silas said flatly, marking a sharp line on the grid. "That is progress. We do it again tomorrow." Silas walked into the adjoining private bathroom to wash his hands, leaving the folded piece of paper resting on the table. Elias turned his head, his breathing heavy. The paper had fluttered slightly in the air conditioning draft, flipping over to reveal the printed side. Elias squinted in the dim light. It was his own formal corporate termination notice issued to Silas Merrick. The text clearly stated that Silas was being discharged without a severance package and that his medical benefits were revoked immediately, all because of a minor 2% acidity variance in the estate's lawn. At the very bottom of the page, scrawled in an aggressive, sharp black cursive, was Elias's own authorizing signature. Elias stopped breathing. The sterile room felt as if all the oxygen had been violently sucked out. He stared at that number. 2%. Dr. Adler had documented that his brain survived the crash because the localized swelling had subsided by exactly 2%. A 2% margin had saved his life. Yet, he had destroyed a man's life, his retirement, and his health care over a 2% variance in the dirt. He had thrown a dedicated worker into the street for a microscopic, invisible failure. And now, that exact same man was using the back of that cruel termination notice to count the seconds Elias could stand on his own 2 feet. The heavy realization of his own past ruthlessness locked Elias Vaughn into a silent, internal prison that felt more restrictive than his amnesia. For 3 days, he did not speak during his rehabilitation sessions. He merely watched the gnarled, arthritic fingers of Silas Merrick grip the wooden pencil, carefully drawing lines on the back of the very document that had stripped him of his dignity. Every time Elias's knees buckled, every time the agonizing neural pain flashed through his lower back, his eyes would catch that bold number written in the margin, 2%. Down in the subterranean administrative hub of Vaughn Logistics, the atmosphere was entirely disconnected from the physical suffering of the recovery ward. Desmond Gaines, a senior corporate forensic auditor with decades of experience tracking black market capital, sat alone in a windowless office. Desmond was a man completely loyal to mathematics. He held no personal affection for Elias, nor did he fear Vivian Vaughn. To him, human beings were flawed, unpredictable entities, while financial ledgers never lied. Desmond adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses, his eyes scanning a localized data anomaly flashing on his dual-monitor workstation. The automated tracking system had flagged a series of highly irregular, rapid transactions initiated from the primary executive treasury account. Over a 96-hour period, 3 separate blocks of liquid assets, totaling $412 million, had been transferred into a newly registered offshore shell company named Apex Maritime Holdings. The digital signature authorizing the emergency liquidity release did not belong to Elias. It was a secondary cryptographic key assigned exclusively to the chief operating officer, Alden Strickland. Desmond pulled a physical file from a secure cabinet, his brow furrowing as he compared the transactions against the standard emergency operating protocols of the firm. According to the foundational corporate charter, the COO was legally authorized to execute large-scale capital reallocations, without board approval only under one specific condition: the absolute certified medical incapacitation of the sitting chief executive. "They aren't protecting the company," Desmond murmured to the empty room, his fingers clicking a sequence on his mechanical keyboard to trace the final routing destination of the capital. "They are actively liquidating the foundation before the state can appoint a neutral trustee. The offshore funds were not being utilized to secure global shipping containers or stabilize fuel supply lines. The capital was being broken into smaller, untraceable tranches, systematically routed through private European banking institutions. It was a textbook corporate strip-and-bleed maneuver. Vivian Vaughn and Alden Strickland were not waiting for the court to grant a permanent conservatorship. They were actively hollowing out the core architecture of Elias's empire, while he was legally classified as an unconscious variable. Desmond opened a blank, heavily encrypted digital document. He did not notify the board, and he did not contact corporate legal counsel. He knew that the moment his inquiry registered on the central network, Strickland's automated security protocols would flag his terminal and revoke his administrative credentials. He needed raw, physical access to the primary server log, a task that required an internal presence inside the executive suite. Back in the secure ward, the digital clock struck 2:22 a.m. Elias stood on his own 2 feet, his body trembling violently, cold sweat dripping from his chin onto the linoleum floor. He was not relying on Silas's physical strength tonight. He was holding his own balance, his toes clawing at the smooth ground as his brain desperately fought to reestablish control over his motor nervous system. 8 seconds, Silas stated flatly, his voice a low growl in the quiet room. "Your spine is starting to remember the gravity. Do not look down at the floor, Elias. Look at the wall." Elias forced his chin up, his breathing ragged, his lungs burning from the sheer physical exertion. "The paper, on the table. Why do you keep it?" Silas did not lower his pencil. He kept his eyes fixed on the grid he had drawn. To remind myself that a storm can tear the leaves off a tree, but it doesn't mean a thing if the roots are deep enough. You signed that paper because you thought you could control the earth by writing your name in black ink. But when you fell, the ink didn't catch you. The earth did. Now step forward. Elias shifted his weight, his right leg lifting a fraction of an inch off the ground. The neural static screamed through his thigh, but he did not fall. He planted his foot exactly 3 inches ahead of his starting position. It was a clumsy, agonizingly slow movement, but it was an entirely deliberate, unassisted human step. Before Silas could mark the progress on the grid, the soft, localized chime of the primary nurse's station echoed from the hallway. The automated security lock on the service entrance clicked, the green status light flashing to red as the internal grid went completely dead. Someone was overriding the malfunction protocol from the main hospital administrative terminal. The sudden red flash of the security override system cast a harsh crimson glare across the sterile white walls of the isolation ward. Silas Merrick did not panic. He methodically folded the crumpled termination notice, slid it back into his heavy canvas work jacket, and stepped back into the deepest shadows of the unlit utility bathroom just as the heavy double doors of the main entrance hissed open with an aggressive, mechanical force. It was not Cora Hensley. 2 corporate security guards dressed in identical black tactical uniforms stepped into the room, their faces completely expressionless. They immediately took flanking positions on either side of the entrance, their hands resting near the holsters of their sidearms. Seconds later, Vivian Vaughn entered the suite, accompanied by Alden Strickland and a sharp, middle-aged legal consultant carrying a leather brief with the gold-embossed seal of Vaughn Logistics. Vivian walked to the foot of the bed, her high heels clicking loudly against the linoleum. She did not look at Elias with concern. Her eyes were fixed on his medical charts, her expression completely cold and analytical. Dr. Adler's team tells me your basic autonomic functions have stabilized, Elias, Vivian said, her voice dropping to a flat, professional tone that echoed off the hard surfaces of the room. But the legal department needs a definitive assessment of your cognitive state for the court hearing on Friday morning. The magistrate requires visual verification that you are unable to process complex administrative tasks. Elias lay back against the pillows, his breathing still slightly ragged from the physical exertion of his secret walk, but his face remained a blank, empty mask. He knew that the slightest hint of recovery, the smallest flicker of human intelligence in his eyes, would force Vivian and Alden to change their tactics. He needed to remain a completely non-responsive variable in their corporate calculations. "He isn't tracking your voice, Vivian," Alden Strickland stated, stepping closer to the bedside terminal to inspect the live cardiac readouts. "The neural static is too thick. His focus is entirely fragmented. Look at his pupillary response. There is no active cognitive engagement." The legal consultant stepped forward, pulling a thick stack of high-grade financial documents from his brief. "Mr. Strickland is correct. Based on the neurological affidavits we have already secured from the daytime staff, the temporary fiduciary control can be fully converted into a permanent corporate conservatorship by tomorrow afternoon. We just need the court-appointed evaluation form stamped by the attending physician." Alden turned to look at the bedside table, his eyes narrowing slightly as he noticed the clean, empty plastic bowl and the faint, unmistakable scent of roasted garlic lingering in the air. He reached out, his gloved hand hovering over the surface of the nightstand. "The room smells like industrial food prep," Alden murmured, his voice tightening with a sudden, sharp suspicion. "The nursing staff is supposed to be administering a strictly controlled synthetic liquid drip. Who authorized solid food in this wing?" Elias kept his eyes fixed on the ceiling, his heart rate monitor ticking upward by a few beats. He did not look toward the bathroom door where Silas was standing in the absolute darkness. He knew that if Alden investigated the secondary entrance, the secret rehabilitation process would be permanently destroyed. The night shift executed a localized metabolic challenge test at midnight. Cora Hensley's voice cut through the tension as she stepped calmly into the room, holding a fresh tray of sterile syringes. She didn't look at Elias or Alden. She walked directly to the primary IV pump, her fingers rapidly inputting a command to override the red security alert on the wall. The olfactory stimulants are part of the standard baseline neurological assessment for severe retrograde amnesia. It is fully documented in the digital log, Mr. Strickland. Alden stared at Cora for 3 long seconds, his face tight, before slowly drawing his hand back from the nightstand. Make sure every milligram of input is logged, nurse. Any unverified variable on this floor is a liability to the board. Vivian turned away from her brother, adjusting her gray blazer with a crisp, definitive motion. The court hearing is scheduled for 10 a.m. The legal team has already prepared the emergency succession press release for the international markets. By noon tomorrow, the market will know that Vaughn Logistics has a permanent, unified leadership structure. Let's leave him to his recovery. The corporate unit exited the room as quickly as they had arrived, the heavy soundproof doors sealing behind them with a definitive thud that returned the ward to its absolute suffocating silence. Silas stepped out from the darkness of the utility bathroom, his weathered face set in a hard, grim expression. He walked over to the bedside table, pulled out the folded termination notice, and looked down at Elias, who was now sitting up, his eyes sharp and completely clear. "They aren't trying to heal you, Elias," Silas said quietly, his gravelly voice filled with a stark, cold reality. "They are counting down the hours until you are legally dead. You have exactly 24 hours to make your brain and your legs work together, or that corporate machine will lock you in this room forever." At 6 a.m., the morning shift log at Memorial General updated automatically. Inside his private terminal, independent forensic auditor Desmond Gaines watched the data streams refresh. He had spent the last 4 hours tracking the routing architecture of Apex Maritime Holdings. The capital bleed was accelerating. Another $85 million had just been converted into international trade credits, completely untraceable once settled. Desmond knew the exact physical layout of the executive floor at Vaughn Logistics. He knew that the raw security tokens authorizing these instant liquidation tranches were stored on a localized physical hardware security module inside Alden Strickland's main office desk. To stop the bleed, he didn't need a digital hack. He needed a physical clone of that encryption key. "They are emptying the vault before the judge even signs the order," Desmond muttered, exporting the ledger files onto an encrypted external drive. He needed a courier, someone who did not exist on the corporate payroll, someone who could move through the logistics hub without triggering a biometric alert. Up in the isolation ward, the early morning sun cut through the heavy blinds, casting cold, gray bars across the room. Elias stood near the window, entirely unassisted. He was not looking at the view. His eyes were fixed on his own hands, tracking the minute tremors in his fingers. The cognitive static in his brain was beginning to clear, forming sharp, isolated islands of memory. He remembered the precise structural layout of his shipping terminals in Rotterdam. He remembered the specific percentage margins of his fuel contracts. He could recall the mathematics of his empire with perfect clarity, but when he looked at the family photograph Vivian had left on the dresser, he felt absolutely nothing. The door disengaged with a light click. Silas stepped into the room, his canvas jacket damp from the morning sleet. He did not bring the thermos this time. Instead, he reached into his breast pocket and placed a sleek black encrypted smartphone flat on the mattress. "A man named Desmond Gaines intercepted me at the lower transit gate," Silas said, his voice dropping to a low, cautious rumble. "He says he works for your audit division. He says your sister and Strickland are stripping the corporate treasury. He needs your primary authorization bypass code to lock the accounts from the inside." Elias looked at the phone, then at Silas. The transition from helpless patient back to corporate titan was jarring. For a split second, the cold, calculating glare of the old Elias Vaughn returned to his eyes. He reached for the phone, his movements sharp, authoritative, and clinical. "Desmond Gaines is correct," Elias stated, his voice regaining its natural dominant cadence. "If Strickland moves those tranches into European trade credits, the liquidity is gone forever. I built that system to be absolute. To override it, Desmond needs my personal cryptographic phrase. Give me the terminal." Elias cleared the lock screen and began typing a 16-character alphanumeric sequence with clinical precision. Silas stood perfectly still, watching the billionaire's fingers fly across the glass. The vulnerability of the past week seemed to vanish, replaced by the detached focus of a man who had spent 20 years crushing competition. Once the sequence was complete, Elias handed the phone back to Silas. "Tell Desmond to execute a localized network freeze on all outbound Apex accounts. He has 48 hours before the automated clearance protocol overrides his block." Silas took the phone, but he did not move toward the door. He looked down at Elias, his dark eyes holding a deep, critical intensity. "You have your numbers back, Mr. Vaughn," Silas said quietly, his voice cutting through the clinical atmosphere. "You look exactly like the man who stood on my lawn and told me my 40 years of work were worth nothing over a 2% error. You look like the man who let my wife lose her clinic coverage without blinking an eye." Elias froze, his hand still extended in the air. The sharp corporate focus in his mind fractured against the memory of the termination notice. He looked at Silas's gnarled, arthritic knuckles, the hands that had held his weight when his knees had buckled, the hands that had brought him food when his own sister had left him to be declared dead. "I remember the lawn, Silas," Elias whispered, his voice dropping its authoritative edge, returning to the raw human vulnerability of the ward. "I remember every word I said to you." "Good," Silas replied flatly, sliding the encrypted phone back into his canvas coat. "Because a man who remembers his wealth but forgets the cost of his dirt is a man who isn't worth saving. Keep practicing your steps. The courtroom doors aren't going to open themselves." The digital clock in the corner of the room advanced to 6:10 a.m. Silas had already vanished back through the unlit utility corridor, leaving Elias alone with the quiet hum of the monitoring machines. The room was dark, but Elias did not return to his bed. He stood in the center of the floor, his weight balanced evenly, forcing his mind to process the duality of his existence. He was Elias Vaughn, the billionaire who calculated human lives in margins and fractions, but he was also the broken man who had been kept alive by a stranger's anger and a bowl of chicken broth. He walked toward the nightstand and picked up the folded termination notice Silas had left behind. Elias ran his thumb over the aggressive, sharp signature at the bottom. He turned the paper over. On the blank side, the crude pencil grid tracked his recovery. Every single line was a testament to physical agony, recorded on the very instrument of Silas's financial ruin. Elias realized his entire empire had been run on the belief that a 2% deviation was a failure that required termination. Yet here, on the back of that exact failure, 2% was the precise metric of his survival. Meanwhile, across the city, Desmond Gaines was navigating the dark corridors of the Vaughn Logistics corporate headquarters. Armed with the alphanumeric bypass code Elias had typed into the encrypted phone, Desmond slipped into the primary server hub on the lower administrative level. The air was freezing, filled with the loud, collective hum of thousands of blade servers processing global supply chain data. Desmond bypassed the security checkpoint using a legacy administrative token that the board had not yet revoked. He plugged his encrypted external drive directly into the localized hardware security module that governed the Apex Maritime Holdings accounts. The alphanumeric sequence Elias provided worked flawlessly. The system recognized the founder's absolute cryptographic signature, opening a hidden diagnostic layer of the corporate treasury. Instantly, the live data stream tracking the $412 million capital flight froze. The outbound European trade credits locked in place, suspended in a state of permanent verification. But as the progress bar on Desmond's drive hit 98%, a sharp red notification banner flashed across his terminal screen, warning that a system override had been detected in the executive suite. Alden Strickland's automated network defense had flagged the unauthorized administrative access. The corporate machine was waking up. Desmond didn't panic. He watched the transfer complete, pulled the encrypted drive from the server rack, and vanished into the service elevator before the physical security team could seal the floor. Back in the isolation ward, Elias heard a soft rustle near the main door. He quickly returned to his bed, pulled the clinical sheets over his legs, and assumed the blank, non-responsive posture he had practiced. The door hissed open. Cora Hensley stepped inside, her face tight with uncharacteristic anxiety. She did not approach the IV pump. Instead, she walked directly to the side of the bed and leaned down, pretending to adjust his pillow. "The board just initiated an emergency legal acceleration," Cora whispered rapidly, her eyes darting toward the security camera in the corner. Vivian's lawyers pushed the magistrate to move the conservatorship hearing forward. It's no longer on Friday afternoon. They scheduled it for 9 a.m. tomorrow morning. Elias didn't move a single muscle in his face, but his jaw tightened beneath the skin. "They know someone is interfering with the accounts," Cora continued, her voice trembling slightly. "They are bringing a private medical transport unit at dawn to move you to a state asylum under full sedation. If you let them put you in that ambulance, Mr. Vaughn, you will never wake up again." Cora finished her adjustments and left the room without another word. Elias stared into the darkness. His body was still weak, his nervous system still misfiring from the trauma. He had less than 6 hours before the corporate machine arrived to erase him permanently. He looked at the termination notice in his hand, his fingers crushing the heavy paper. The time for hiding was over. At 6:30 a.m., the first pale blue light of dawn cut through the metallic blinds of the isolation ward. Elias Vaughn stood motionless in the center of the room. He had torn the intravenous lines from the back of his right hand, pressing a sterile gauze pad against the minor bleeding until it stopped. The physical reliance on the hospital bed was entirely gone. His posture was rigid, his weight anchored firmly to the floor, but inside his chest, a massive psychological battle was raging. The return of his cognitive faculties had brought back his old, dominant identity with the force of a tidal wave. He remembered the exact financial algorithms that had made him a billionaire. He remembered the precise corporate structural layers he had used to destroy his global competitors. But as he looked down at his bare feet on the cold linoleum, the cold, detached arrogance of the old Elias Vaughn began to seep into his thoughts. The utility door clicked open right on schedule. Silas Merrick stepped through the threshold, holding a clean change of civilian clothes, a dark charcoal suit that he had managed to retrieve from Elias's private office locker with Desmond's assistance. Silas stopped when he saw Elias standing completely unassisted, surrounded by torn medical tape and silenced monitoring screens. "The ambulance is entering the lower gates," Silas said, his gravelly voice tight. "We have 12 minutes before the private transport team reaches this floor with the chemical sedatives. Put these on." Elias took the tailored suit, his movements suddenly sharp, authoritative, and completely devoid of the warmth or vulnerability he had shown over the past week. He threw the hospital gown aside and began dressing with the cold, methodical efficiency of a CEO preparing for a hostile board meeting. Desmond's network freeze worked perfectly, Elias stated, his voice returning to its natural, dominant baritone. "The Apex Maritime accounts are locked in place. Vivian and Alden are completely trapped. I am going to walk into that courthouse, revoke their administrative access, and liquidate their personal shares before the market closes." Silas watched him lace his leather shoes, his dark eyes narrowing as he noted the sudden, chilling transformation in the billionaire's demeanor. The helpless man, who had wept over a bowl of chicken broth, had vanished, replaced by the exact same ruthless titan who had ruined Silas's life on the south lawn. "You sound exactly like the old Elias Vaughn," Silas whispered, his voice holding a deep, resonant disappointment. "The man who measures human beings in profit margins and lines of code." Elias tightened his silk tie, looking at Silas through the reflection of the dark window glass. "The corporate world doesn't run on sympathy, Silas. It runs on momentum and power. I appreciate your assistance in keeping me alive, and I will ensure your pension and medical benefits are fully restored with a substantial financial bonus once I regain control of the treasury. I will write you a check that will settle your debt forever." Silas let out a short, cold breath that was completely devoid of anger, holding only absolute disgust. He stepped toward the nightstand and picked up the folded termination notice, sliding it into his canvas jacket. "You think you can balance a man's life with a pen and a checkbook, Mr. Vaughn," Silas said quietly, his voice cutting through the clinical room like stone. "I didn't risk a federal trespassing charge and spend 8 nights dragging your dead weight off that mattress for a bonus. I did it because I thought there was a human being buried under all that money. But I was wrong. Your memory came back, but your soul stayed dead." Silas turned his back on the billionaire, walking toward the utility door without looking back. "The service elevator is clear. Go save your $3 billion machine, Elias. You are entirely on your own." The heavy click of the utility door ceiling, shut behind Silas Merrick, sounded like a definitive verdict. Elias Vaughn stood entirely alone in the center of the quiet room, dressed in his tailored charcoal suit. The expensive fabric felt heavy against his shoulders, a physical armor for the corporate warfare awaiting him. Yet, the air in the room suddenly felt completely freezing, stripped of the scent of roasted garlic and the steady, grounding presence of the old landscaper. Elias looked at his hands. They were steady now, the motor functions firing with the precision of a finely tuned machine. His mind was flooded with numbers, legal statutes, and strategic countermeasures to deploy against Vivienne and Alden Strickland. He had exactly what he wanted: his memory, his status, and his power. But as he looked at the empty nightstand where the termination notice had rested, a massive, unexpected hollow opened in his chest. He moved toward the primary exit, his leather shoes clicking against the hard linoleum. Every step he took was smooth, but his mind kept flashing back to the crude pencil grid Silas had drawn. He remembered the blinding pain of night 3, the sheer physical agony of trying to hold his own weight for 4 seconds, and the rough, calloused hands that had caught him before he hit the ground. Silas hadn't caught him because he was a billionaire. Silas had caught him because he was a collapsing human being. Elias stopped his hand inches from the door handle. He looked at the reflection of his face in the polished steel surface. For 20 years, he had operated under the assumption that anything failing a metric was a weak link to be discarded. He had built Vivienne into the monster she was now, a perfect mirror of his own cold philosophy. She was trying to destroy him, using the exact rules he had authored. Suddenly, the cold, detached logic of his old identity felt like a suffocating trap. If he walked out that door, took back his company, and simply wrote a check to bury his guilt, he would be proving that the crash had changed nothing. He would be choosing to remain the machine that chewed up people like Silas and spat them out for a 2% error. A sharp mechanical buzz cut through the room. The primary security terminal flashed a yellow warning light. The private medical transport unit had just cleared the main lobby elevators and was moving down the secure corridor toward his suite. They were coming to sedate an unconscious asset. Elias did not pull open the main door to run for the service elevator. Instead, he spun around and walked directly into the adjoining unlit utility bathroom. He pushed through the secondary maintenance access panel, stepping into the narrow concrete service corridor, where the facility's raw structural lines, pipes, and electrical grids were exposed. He ran down the concrete stairs, his knees aching from the rapid impact, but he did not slow down. He didn't care about the $3 billion empire at the courthouse anymore. He needed to find the one person who had looked at his broken body and decided he was still worth saving. Elias reached the lower transit gate just as Silas was walking toward the heavy metal exit doors that led out into the freezing morning sleet. "Silas!" Elias called out, his voice cracking, completely losing its dominant, polished executive baritone. The older man stopped, his broad shoulders tensing beneath his damp canvas work jacket. He slowly turned around, his dark eyes cold, distant, and completely unreadable as he looked at the billionaire standing under the raw industrial lighting of the basement. "The service elevator is behind you, Mr. Vaughn," Silas said flatly, his gravelly voice dropping into a low rumble. "The courthouse is uptown. You're heading the wrong way." Elias took 3 steps forward, his breathing ragged, his posture cracking as he looked at the man he had wronged. "I don't want the checkbook, Silas, and I'm not going to the courthouse to save the machine. I'm going there to break it. But I can't walk into that room alone." Silas Merrick did not answer immediately. He stood by the heavy metal exit doors, the cold winter wind howling through the frame, his dark eyes locked onto Elias Vaughn. He looked at the tailored charcoal suit, then at the desperate raw look in the billionaire's eyes, a look that had nothing to do with corporate power. Slowly, Silas reached into his canvas jacket, pulled out the folded termination notice, and stepped back into the concrete corridor. "You want to break the machine, Elias?" Silas asked, his gravelly voice echoing off the bare walls. "Then you need to understand that the machine isn't just Vivienne or Alden. It's the way you taught them to look at the world. If we go to that courthouse, we aren't fighting for your money. We are fighting for the people who get crushed under it." "I know," Elias said, his voice steadying, the transformation within him finally cementing into a quiet, deliberate resolve. "That is exactly why I need you there. Let's go." Silas gave a single firm nod. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the encrypted smartphone, dialing the independent auditor. "Desmond, we are moving. Meet us at the municipal courthouse with the primary ledger drive. We have less than 30 minutes before the hearing begins." Desmond Gaines's voice came through the speaker, crisp and entirely unbothered by the ticking clock. "I'm already parked 2 blocks away from the magistrate's office. The network freeze on the Apex Maritime accounts triggered an automatic emergency alert on Alden Strickland's phone 5 minutes ago. He knows the vault is locked, and he knows someone inside the system did it. He will be looking to push the conservatorship through the absolute second the doors open." "We are on our way," Elias said, taking the phone from Silas. "Desmond, ensure the forensic files tracking the $412 million capital flight are formatted for immediate judicial review. We aren't going to argue about my memory. We are going to present a criminal corporate strip and bleed maneuver." 10 minutes later, Silas's battered, rusted utility truck tore through the freezing rain toward the city center. Elias sat in the passenger seat, the expensive fabric of his suit contrasting sharply with the torn vinyl and the smell of fuel oil inside the cab. His knees were throbbing with a dull, persistent ache from the rapid descent down the hospital stairs, but he kept his eyes fixed straight ahead. He unfolded the termination notice resting on the dashboard. He didn't look at his own aggressive signature at the bottom anymore. Instead, he looked at the crude pencil grid on the reverse side. Every line represented a milestone achieved through agonizing pain and unyielding human discipline. This piece of paper was no longer a symbol of destruction. It was the blueprint of his new foundation. "Your hands are shaking, Elias," Silas noticed, his eyes remaining on the slick, wet pavement ahead. "Is the neural static coming back?" "No," Elias replied quietly, his fingers tracing the pencil markings. "It's not the static, it's the weight. I spent 20 years believing that eliminating weak links was the only way to build something permanent. I never realized that when you cut away the people who hold the ground, you leave the entire structure floating in a vacuum. A tree doesn't praise its own roots until the wind starts trying to pull it out of the dirt," Silas said, shifting the heavy gear stick with his swollen, arthritic knuckles. Vivian and Strickland are about to find out how flimsy a house is when it's built entirely out of glass and numbers. The truck skidded to a halt in front of the massive stone steps of the municipal courthouse at exactly 8:48 a.m. The rain had turned into a thick, blinding sleet. Through the heavy downpour, Elias could see 3 black corporate sedans parked directly in the judicial loading zone. Desmond Gaines emerged from the shadow of the concrete columns, dressed in a damp trench coat, holding a sleek silver hardware drive securely under his arm. He didn't offer a greeting. He simply looked at Elias, checking the clarity in the billionaire's eyes. "Strickland brought the entire legal department," Desmond stated flatly, his wire-rimmed glasses covered in tiny droplets of water. "They have already bypassed the public registry desk and are inside the magistrate's private chambers on the 4th floor. They are presenting the emergency medical affidavit right now." Elias stepped out of the truck, his leather shoes hitting the icy pavement. A sharp flash of neural pain shot up his left leg, causing his balance to falter for a fraction of a second. But before his knee could buckle, Silas's heavy, calloused hand gripped him firmly by the elbow, stabilizing him against the freezing wind. "Hold your frame, Elias," Silas growled low in his ear. "Keep your chin up. We walk into this room together." The interior of the municipal courthouse was a cavernous expanse of cold marble, echoing with the distant murmur of morning legal proceedings. Elias, Silas, and Desmond moved toward the main bank of elevators, their small unit cutting a stark path through the crowded lobby. Elias leaned heavily on his right side to overcompensate for the persistent static firing through his left leg, but he refused to slow down. When the elevator doors opened on the 4th floor, the sterile, institutional quiet of the judicial chambers enveloped them. At the far end of the carpeted corridor, standing directly outside the double doors of courtroom 4B, was Alden Strickland. He was intensely focused on his smartphone, his brow furrowed as his fingers flew across the screen, desperately trying to bypass the absolute network lock that Desmond had placed on the Apex Maritime accounts. Alden heard the distinct, heavy rhythm of footsteps approaching. He clicked his phone screen off and looked up. His cold, calculating eyes narrowed to absolute slits as he saw Elias Vaughn walking toward him, not in a hospital gown, not sedated, and not broken. "Elias," Alden said, his voice dropping into a tense, forced baritone as he took a defensive step back toward the courtroom doors. "You shouldn't be out of the trauma ward. Your medical profile is under an absolute quarantine directive. Moving you from that facility is a severe liability." Elias stopped exactly 3 feet from his chief operating officer. The authoritative, chilling presence that had built Vaughn Logistics returned to his frame, but his eyes held a completely different, grounded intensity. "The quarantine directive is over, Alden," Elias stated, his voice a low, resonant blade that echoed down the quiet hallway. "And the network freeze on the Apex accounts isn't a glitch. I authorized it myself." Alden's gaze shifted rapidly from Elias to the independent auditor standing at his flank. He saw the silver hardware drive grip tightly under Desmond's arm, and the realization hit him like a physical blow. The corporate strategy was unraveling. "This is a massive compliance violation, Gaines," Alden muttered, his eyes flashing with a sudden, desperate venom as he looked at the auditor. "You have bypassed executive security protocols. Accessing the primary server hub without board approval is grounds for immediate termination and federal prosecution." Desmond Gaines did not blink behind his wire-rimmed glasses. He reached up, calmly adjusting his trench coat collar, his face completely devoid of fear. "I don't care about the board's approval, Mr. Strickland," Desmond replied flatly, his voice carrying the absolute weight of a mathematical truth. "I care about the balance sheet, and right now, the balance sheet says you have systematically funneled $412 million into a shell corporation over a 96-hour period. That isn't compliance. That is grand larceny." Before Alden could execute a countermove or signal the corporate security team waiting in the lower lobby, The heavy mahogany doors of courtroom 4B swung open. Vivian Vaughn's lead legal consultant stepped into the hallway, holding a freshly stamped stack of expedited judicial motions. "Alden, the magistrate is ready to sign the temporary conservatorship order," the lawyer stated rapidly, his eyes fixed on his papers before he looked up and froze. Elias did not wait for an invitation. He stepped past Alden, his leather shoes gripping the carpeted floor with absolute purpose. Silas and Desmond followed immediately behind him, their presence forming an unyielding wall of human momentum. As Elias pushed through the inner threshold of the private courtroom, he saw Vivian sitting at the plaintiff's table, her pen poised over a legal document, her face completely confident. She was seconds away from legally absorbing her brother's life. Elias walked directly down the center aisle, his caneless stride heavy but unbroken. "Put the pen down, Vivian," he commanded. Vivian Vaughn froze, her hand hovering a fraction of an inch above the legal document. The sterile, wood-paneled courtroom felt suddenly devoid of air as she slowly lifted her head. Her eyes, usually locked in a state of cold, calculated precision, widened in absolute disbelief. Standing at the bar of the court, dressed in his sharp charcoal suit, was her brother. The magistrate, an elderly judge with deep-set eyes and a reputation for strict procedural adherence, looked up from his bench, his glasses sliding down his nose. "What is the meaning of this interruption? This is a closed executive hearing." "My name is Elias Vaughn, Your Honor," Elias said, his voice a commanding baritone that filled the high-ceilinged room, completely stripping it of its quiet formality. He took 2 steps toward the plaintiff's table, his left leg firing a sharp spike of neural pain, but his posture remained unyielding. "And I am here to object to the emergency petition for my own conservatorship." Vivian's lead counsel recovered his composure instantly, stepping forward to block Elias from the judge's view. "Your Honor, this individual has recently suffered a catastrophic traumatic brain injury. According to the medical affidavits we filed at 8 a.m., he is currently experiencing profound retrograde amnesia and total cognitive displacement. He is legally non-responsive and under an executive medical quarantine. The medical quarantine was a corporate fabrication designed to enforce my isolation." Elias replied flatly, his eyes locking directly onto his sister. Vivian did not look away, but the color was rapidly draining from her face. "My cognitive faculties are fully restored. I am completely aware of my identity, my assets, and the fraudulent asset liquidation currently being executed by my board of directors." Alden Strickland entered the courtroom, his face tight as he moved to Vivian's side, whispering urgently into her ear. The corporate trap they had spent 96 hours constructing was collapsing in real time. The magistrate leaned forward, his hands flat on the oak bench. "Mr. Vaughn, the petition before me states that you are unable to recognize your own family or manage the basic operational logistics of your firm. It alleges that you are entirely incapacitated." "I was incapacitated, Your Honor," Elias stated, his voice dropping to a low, grounded cadence that held no corporate arrogance, only absolute certainty. "But my recovery was not monitored by my board or my family. It was documented by the man standing at the back of this courtroom." Elias turned slightly, gesturing toward the gallery. Silas Merrick stood beneath the brass light fixtures, his heavy canvas work jacket damp with sleet, his weathered face hard and unreadable. He looked entirely out of place among the polished mahogany and the expensive wool suits, but his presence carried the weight of an unshakable anchor. "That is Silas Merrick," Elias continued, his fingers reaching into his jacket pocket. He pulled out the folded, crumpled termination notice and held it up before the judge. "He is a former senior specialist whom I ruthlessly fired without a severance package just 72 hours before my accident, all over a microscopic 2% variance in my estate's soil. Yet, while my sister and my COO were using my trauma to declare me socially abandoned and strip my treasury, This man breached my security perimeter every night to keep me alive. Elias walked to the bench, placing the crumpled paper flat on the wooden railing. On the reverse side of this termination notice, Mr. Merrick recorded every second I stood and every clumsy step I took while my brain was rebuilding its pathways. It is the only accurate medical log of my rehabilitation. I did not survive because of my wealth, Your Honor. I survived because of a 2% margin of human decency that my own company deemed a failure. The magistrate picked up the paper, his eyes scanning the crude pencil grid drawn on the back, then looking down at Elias's bold black signature on the front. Vivian stood up, her knuckles turning white against the table. Elias, this emotional display does not change the structural reality of the corporation. The markets require stability. You are disrupting the unified leadership of the firm over a personal grievance. The stability of the firm is not what you were protecting, Vivienne, Elias said coldly. He turned back to the gallery and nodded to the forensic auditor. Desmond, present the drive. Desmond Gaines stepped past the low wooden gate of the bar, his movements methodical and entirely calm. He placed the sleek silver hardware drive directly onto the clerk's desk, connecting it to the court's digital display network. Instantly, the high-definition monitors mounted on the courtroom walls flickered to life, illuminating the wood-paneled room with stark glowing ledgers and bright red tracking lines. Your Honor, Desmond stated, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses as he brought up a master data sheet. What you are looking at is a live forensic breakdown of the Vaughn Logistics Executive Treasury account over the past 96 hours. While the petitioner claimed to be preserving corporate stability, $412 million were systematically pulled from our liquid reserves. The magistrate leaned forward, his eyes tracking the complex routing map on the screen. Where was the capital directed, Mr. Gaines? To an offshore shell entity registered under the name Apex Maritime Holdings, Desmond replied, his finger tapping the glass terminal. The transfers were broken into smaller, untraceable tranches, routed through private European banking institutions. The cryptographic authorization key used to release these funds did not belong to the CEO. It was executed by Chief Operating Officer Alden Strickland, using an emergency incapacity clause that has not been legally verified by this court. The room fell into an absolute suffocating silence. The legal consultants for the board slowly stepped away from the plaintiff's table, realizing they were no longer arguing a civil conservatorship. They were standing inside a live criminal investigation. Alden Strickland's face turned an ash-gray color. He looked toward the exit, his hand instinctively moving toward his jacket pocket, but his path was already blocked by the quiet, imposing presence of the court's security deputies. "This is an administrative reallocation," Vivian said, her voice tight, a rare flicker of panic cutting through her cold, calculated exterior. "The board has the authority to protect assets from market volatility during a leadership vacuum." "You weren't protecting assets, Vivian," Elias said, his voice dropping to a low, icy baritone that cut off her defense. "You were bleeding the engine dry before the court could look inside the machine. You applied my own rules of survival against me, but you forgot that a machine cannot run when you completely hollow out its core." The magistrate looked down from his bench, his face set in a hard, uncompromising expression. He took the crumpled termination notice that Elias had provided, placed it on top of the forensic audit files, and picked up his heavy wooden gavel. "The petition for an emergency corporate conservatorship is denied with prejudice," the judge announced, his voice echoing off the high stone walls. Furthermore, based on the forensic evidence presented by Mr. Gaines, this court is issuing an immediate freeze on all personal assets held by Vivian Vaughn and Alden Strickland. Federal marshals will be notified to secure the primary executive suite at Vaughn Logistics, pending a full grand jury investigation. The heavy strike of the gavel sounded like a thunderclap in the quiet room. Elias did not watch the deputies approach the plaintiff's table to escort Alden and Vivienne into the secondary chambers for questioning. He turned his back on the corporate world he had spent 20 years building, his stride steady and deliberate as he walked down the center aisle toward the gallery. Silas Merrick stood by the heavy mahogany exit doors, his canvas coat unbuttoned, his dark eyes watching the billionaire with a quiet, measured assessment. Elias stopped right in front of him, the cold arrogance of his old life completely gone from his face. "The machine is broken, Silas," Elias said quietly, his voice carrying the raw, exhausted weight of a man who had finally found his footing. "The board is gone. The numbers don't rule this room anymore." Silas looked at him for a long moment before extending his large, rough hand. "Then, let's go back outside, Mr. Vaughn. The rain is clearing, and we have a lot of dirt to fix." The heavy limestone stairs of the courthouse were slick with melting ice, but Elias Vaughn walked down them without looking back. For the first time in 20 years, his mind was completely silent. No stock tickers, no logistics algorithms, no cold calculations of human variables. Beside him, Silas Merrick set a slow, steady pace, his heavy boots crunching against the wet pavement. They reached the rusted utility truck parked by the curb. Desmond Gaines stood by the passenger side, his trench coat damp, holding the master drive that had just dismantled the board. "The federal freeze is already propagating through the banking network, Elias," Desmond said, his tone as clinical as ever. "By tomorrow morning, the restructure of Vaughn Logistics will be official. You have total control of the treasury again. What are the first orders for the remaining shareholders?" Elias stopped, his eyes tracing the gray city skyline, then dropping to the worn, oil-stained floor of Silas's truck cab. "The first order is to liquidate our entire corporate real estate portfolio on the south side," Elias stated, his voice quiet but holding an absolute, unshakable authority. "We are converting those funds into a localized community trust. Every single worker who was terminated under the old margin efficiency protocol over the past 5 years is to be located. Their pensions are to be fully reinstated, and their medical coverage backdated to the day they were let go." Desmond's eyes widened slightly behind his glasses. "That will cause an immediate 12% dip in our liquid capital reserves. The market analysts will flag it as an irrational asset drain." "Let them flag it," Elias replied flatly, a slight genuine smile touching the corner of his lips. "The market will just have to learn how to survive on a tighter margin. Just get it done, Desmond." The auditor gave a single respectful nod, tucked the drive under his arm, and walked toward the subway entrance. Silas opened the heavy creaking door of the utility truck, the interior smelling of wet canvas and rich coffee. He climbed into the driver's seat and started the engine, the old block rattling the frame of the cab. He looked out the open window at Elias, who was still standing on the pavement, looking down at his polished leather shoes. "You're going to ruin that expensive suit if you keep standing in the slush, Mr. Vaughn," Silas grunted, shifting the heavy gear stick into first. "Get in. The nursery in Hernando County opens at noon, and we need to load 40 yards of organic topsoil before the ground freezes solid." Elias looked up, the freezing sleet stinging his face, but he didn't feel the cold anymore. He climbed into the passenger seat, slamming the rusted door shut behind him. He reached into his breast pocket and pulled out his gold executive pen, placing it neatly into the glove box next to a pair of grease-stained pliers. 40 yards sounds like a lot of heavy lifting, Silas," Elias said, leaning his head back against the torn vinyl headrest as the truck pulled away from the courthouse curb. "It is," Silas replied, his rough, calloused hands gripping the steering wheel with absolute certainty as they headed toward the edge of the city. "But, like I told you, Elias, if you want something to grow back right, you have to start by working the dirt." They arrived at the South Estate just as the winter sun broke through the clouds. It was on this exact lawn that Elias had ruthlessly fired Silas over a 2% acidity variance in the soil. Silas backed the truck onto the grass and lowered the heavy steel tailgate. "Grab a shovel, Mr. Vaughn. The soil won't move itself." Elias took off his $10,000 suit jacket, rolled up his sleeves, and grabbed a rusted spade. For the next 4 hours, they worked in absolute silence. The physical labor was brutal. Elias's muscles, still recovering from trauma, screamed in protest. His hands, unaccustomed to manual labor, blistered and bled. But Elias did not stop. Every time his knees threatened to buckle, he thought of the pencil grid drawn on the back of Silas's termination notice. He thought of the agonizing seconds he spent trying to stand in that dark hospital room, held up only by the calloused hands of the man he had wronged. By late afternoon, the sterile, chemically treated grass was gone, replaced by rich, breathing earth. It wasn't mathematically perfect, but it was alive. Elias collapsed onto the tailgate, his expensive shirt soaked in sweat and dirt. Silas walked over, handed him a dented steel thermos, and sat down. "Drink," Silas grunted. "You lose heat fast when you stop moving." Elias took a sip of the bitter black coffee. He looked at Silas, studying the deep, weathered lines on his face. "I spent 20 years building an empire. I measured every variable. I eliminated every flaw. I thought that was the only way to build an unbreakable foundation." "You built a foundation out of glass," Silas replied quietly. "Glass looks perfect, but the second the ground shakes, glass shatters. Dirt doesn't shatter. Dirt absorbs the impact. It shifts, it settles, and it holds the roots." Elias looked at his ruined, blistered hands. "You saved my life, Silas. I took everything from you, threw you into the street, and you still caught me when I fell." "I didn't catch a CEO," Silas said firmly. "I caught a broken man. I did it because nobody deserves to learn how to stand alone in the dark." Silas reached into his heavy canvas jacket and pulled out the crumpled termination notice. He smoothed it out, looking at the bold black signature, then flipped it over to the pencil grid. "This paper," Silas said quietly, "is the only accurate ledger your company ever produced. Put it in a frame on your desk. Every time you calculate a margin, look at it and remember exactly what a 2% failure looks like." Silas didn't say goodbye. He didn't ask for a check. He simply climbed into the cab, started the engine, and drove away. Elias Vaughn was left entirely alone on the edge of the freshly turned field. He was covered in mud, his muscles aching, his suit ruined. He carefully folded the termination notice, sliding it into the breast pocket of his shirt, directly over his heart. He stood up from the tailgate, his boots planting firmly into the dark, uneven earth. The wind howled, but he didn't feel the cold. He felt the roots taking hold. The empire of glass was gone. The real work had finally begun. Thank you for walking this path with Elias and Silas over these 16 parts. This journey was never really about corporate takeovers or billions of dollars. It was a reminder that true strength isn't found in perfect margins, but in the people who hold us up when our own foundations crumble. I hope this story made you look at the roots in your own life a little differently today. If this story resonated with you, please hit that like button to let me know. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss our next deep dive into human nature. And let me know in the comments, who was the person in your life that caught you when you were falling? I read every single one. Thank you for being part of this community, and I'll see you in the next one.